The first system that we tackled in Bio 132 is the endocrine system, which is going to work in conjunction with the nervous system in maintaining virtually every process in our bodies. So we need to talk about intercellular communication first. And there are going to be 4 major mechanisms for doing that. We've already talked about gap junctions in 131. And gap junctions are going to provide direct intercellular communication. So literally cell-to-cell communication. Those gap junctions are going to allow small ions, lipid-soluble materials, small solutes, anything that's small enough to move from cell to cell. And the effects of this communication is generally limited to cells that are right next to each other, and they're generally of a similar type. Paracrine communication means that there's going to be some sort of intercellular communication through extracellular fluid. There are going to be these factors that are produced, which are known as paracrine factors, which act like local hormones, which means they will be floating around in the fluid around cells, the extracellular fluid, and will target nearby cells. Classic example of that is during embryogenesis. A paracrine factor is released by a cell. It will be moved or transported to nearby undifferentiated cells, and it'll trigger those cells to differentiate into a specific type of cell. The effects of these paracrine factors are usually limited to a small area. The concentration of those factors has to be relatively high, and in addition to that, the target cells have to have receptors and are less than a millimeter distant. We talked about synaptic communication when we talked about the neuromuscular junction, and when we talked about synapses within the nervous system. So you have neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers that are going to travel across synaptic clefts. The effects will be limited to specific target cells. And of course, those cells that are the postsynaptic membrane have to have the appropriate receptors for that neurotransmitter that is released from the presynaptic neuron. This part of the class is all about endocrine communication. The chemical messengers will be hormones, which are going to be secreted by endocrine glands. They are released into the circulatory system, so they will travel around the body via the bloodstream. The effect of hormones will be limited to target cells that have to have the specific receptors for those hormones. The cells are frequently quite distant, and we'll talk more about hormones throughout the entire endocrine system. This shows you what happens. So you have an endocrine gland, that's a generic endocrine gland there. You can see up here that the endocrine gland is releasing a chemical messenger, the hormone, into the circulatory system. Here's another one releasing it into this capillary, or here, or here, or here. Once the hormone is in the circulatory system, it will circulate around the body until it reaches its target cell. And you have to remember that those target cells absolutely positively must have receptors. No receptors, no reaction. Gamete receptors, no reaction. The general function of the endocrine system, and this is a very general function, is to integrate body systems and maintain homeostasis through specific actions. Glands are going to be the effectors of, does anybody remember? The central nervous system. and more specifically, which division of the central nervous system. So let's talk about why endocrine dysfunction is so difficult to diagnose. Because if you are in endocrinology, it is extremely difficult to diagnose people who have endocrine disorders. Why might that be? Let's take a look at some of the signs and symptoms of endocrine system dysfunction versus neuromusculoskeletal dysfunction. You might have signs and symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, or muscle weakness, or atrophy, or myalgia, muscle pain, arthralgia, joint pain. You might be fatigued. You might have signs or symptoms associated with carpal tunnel syndrome, or symptoms associated with degenerative joint disease, periarthritis, etc., etc. Any one of those symptoms or a combination of those symptoms can also be indicative of endocrine issues. Systemically, take a look at the list of those. Any one of those symptoms or mix of those symptoms can be associated with a number of other conditions that are not specific to the endocrine system. So when we talk about why it is difficult to diagnose endocrine disorders, it is because patients often have symptoms that seem vague or can be associated with multiple other conditions, or which might be extreme one week and gone the next, being remitted the next. That is why it is so difficult to diagnose dysfunction within the endocrine system. So let's look at the differences between the endocrine system and the nervous system. Nervous system, immediate response, right? So you see something and you want to pick it up. Think spinal reflex arc. Think some sort of sympathetic response. Oftentimes it's associated with crisis management. The chemical messengers for the nervous system will act at specific locations. You will have specific neuronal pathways or circuits for certain activities. The neurotransmitters themselves are going to act across a tiny little distance, just that synaptic cleft. Versus the endocrine system tends to have longer term effects and slower responses. So if you think about a baby who's just been born, it takes 20 plus years for that child to reach skeletal maturity. Endocrine system is going to regulate ongoing processes. So calcium homeostasis, retaining or maintaining the appropriate calcium levels within the blood lasts a lifetime. Also, the endocrine system is going to act at diffuse locations. So the chemical messengers will be the hormones, and those hormones are going to be secreted into the circulatory system and will travel all the way around the body until they get to their target cell, which may be at a very distant point from where the gland secreted the hormone. What about similarities? Both of them are going to rely on the release of chemical messengers. In the nervous system, you're talking neurotransmitters. In the endocrine system, you're talking hormones. Some of those chemical messengers are actually shared, or they're the same in both systems. Think epinephrine, think norepinephrine. Both are primarily going to be dependent on negative feedback systems. I would know that forever if I were you. Both the endocrine system and the nervous system are primarily dependent on negative feedback systems. They do also have a common goal, which is to preserve and support homeostasis of various functions in our bodies. The primary function of the endocrine system is to regulate our body's processes, not control them, but to regulate them. And the system can be affected by disease, diet, so you are what you eat, and of course, stress. So let's talk very briefly about the importance of living in the parasympathetic state. You remember that the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. We evolved to spend much of our time in the parasympathetic state, with occasional excursions off into the sympathetic state when you're under stress because you're either going to be attacked by a predator or you need to catch prey. We spend much of our lives in the sympathetic state due to the way that we live them, and therefore we are adding to diseases and stresses on our body that are going to impact the endocrine system. Rest and relax, rest and digest. That's how you want to live. You want to live in a parasympathetic state as much as possible. Three actually important definitions. Endocrine glands is a ductless gland that will secrete hormones into the circulatory system. An exocrine gland is a gland that is going to secrete a substance onto the surface of a tissue. Exocrine glands are not associated with the endocrine system. Let's define the term hormone. And I would memorize this if I were you. A hormone is a chemical messenger secreted by an endocrine gland, which travels around the body through the circulatory system until it reaches its target cell. I would know that definition if I were you. In the next section, we'll talk more about hormones and the types there are and how those types act. So stay tuned.